Hi, my name is John Petty, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Growing Up in Flip Flops. This episode I've entitled, My Middle Name is Cautious. Growing up in Florida had a lot of wonderful, wonderful benefits that I have recalled in a lot of the previous podcasts. But there are also some downsides to living in Florida. I'm not going to take the opportunity to make a cheap joke here, but a lot of the downsides involve wildlife, and not necessarily the pythons in the Everglades, but those are out there, or the mosquitoes that just seem to swarm everywhere. Instead, I want to focus on some experiences I had and how they really shaped basically an outlook on life. I will provide a little bit of a warning that some of these have a little bit of a yikes factor to them, but again, in experiencing them, they certainly did have a yikes factor to me. While each of these is its own separate little vignette, they did have, as I've stated, a cumulative effect on me. One of my duties around the house, after I had collected whatever citrus fruits and juiced them for my mother and sister for the breakfast table, I went out on the front steps and collected the newspaper for my mother to read in the morning at the breakfast table. The paper would arrive rolled up with a rubber band around it where the delivery person had thrown it either on the sidewalk or onto the steps of the house. This morning I went out, collected it. As I was coming back in, I took off the rubber band and opened up the newspaper to just see what the headline was. And as I unfurled the newspaper, there in my hands was a baby coral snake that had found its way into the bound newspaper. Obviously, it was a cold day that morning, and the newspaper had been in a warm car, and the coral snake found a warm spot to hide. But here I'm holding a newspaper with a coral snake literally inches from my hand. Well, out went a yikes with me. I dropped the newspaper when my heart stopped beating and I stopped shaking and the snake slithered away. Little lesson I learned was every time subsequent to that I came out and got that newspaper, I opened it so that I took it with one hand, rolled off the rubber band, and shook it to make sure there was not another snake in the newspaper. Second little vignette was one day when I was down at the beach. I could see that there was a school of bait fish that was offshore, and you could tell that because the pelicans and seagulls were diving into this school of fish and swarming out there. And while I was standing there on the beach, all of a sudden I see this rustle in the water, and suddenly a barracuda, which had been chasing one of the bait fish, literally threw itself onto the beach near my feet. Now, if you've never seen a barracuda, it's basically, think of a long tube with teeth on one end. They are very, very ferocious looking. They are basically a eating machine. But this thing was so ferocious, it just in a craze, chasing a bait fish into the shallows. I mean, right on the beach, literally threw itself on the beach. The little lesson I learned from that, if I saw bait fish or a school of mullet near the shoreline, I wasn't going in the water. The bait fish were going to draw predator fish, and I wasn't going to be out in the water near where predator fish were running around, especially after I'd seen a barracuda literally throw itself onto the beach chasing after something. I didn't want to be mistaken for bait fish. My third little warning involves stingrays. Stingrays tend to nestle down into shallow water and they bury themselves in the sand. You really can't see them. If it's low tide and you go out onto one of the bars that are exposed at low tide off the beach and you're walking along, it's best to shuffle your feet so that you don't step on the barb on the tail of a stingray. I have seen where somebody has done that. Here's a yikes moment. It literally looks like somebody has taken a razor blade to the sole of somebody's foot. It is obviously extremely painful. It's in salt water. You don't want to see it. You don't want to experience it. So, as a result, anytime I had to either jump off a boat onto an exposed sandbar or was out walking, I wasn't going barefoot. I was wearing canvas, thick-soled deck shoes. I would have had a tan over my whole body, except my feet were as white as sheets because I always wore those deck shoes in order to protect the soles of my feet in that situation. Last story, I was visiting a high school friend who lived in a relatively new development. As part of this development, and because that area of Southwest Florida is so flat, the developers had dredged out a retention pond and took the spill from the retention pond and put it around the pond to literally build up a little bit of elevation so that everything was not as flat as anything, so that there was some level of drainage. And if there was drainage, it went into this pond. Now, the pond was round. They had built houses facing the large retention pond. A drive, a road went around the circle outside this pond. And on the inside of the street, there was a sidewalk over by the retention pond. So you've got an idea of what this was like. Well, he and I have been out in his front yard doing God knows what, and we heard this woman about 150 yards away from us just screaming, just crazy screaming. We ran over there to see what was going on, and there was a middle-aged woman standing there just trembling, shaking, screaming. We couldn't see what was wrong with her, and ma'am, and she just hysterical, screaming. And then we noticed on her wrist was a dog leash with no dog on the end of it. She had been walking down by the retention pond. Fortunately for her, her pet dog was between her and the retention pond. And obviously an alligator had come up and in one snatch taken her dog, snapped the leash. Very fortunate for that woman that the leash snapped, or she would have gone in with it. She's also extremely fortunate that the dog was between her and the alligator. If she had been the one on the inside, the gator may have gone after her. When I see signs that say beware of alligator, I heed them. I have seen what an alligator can do, and I'm not taking any chances. The great Gene Shepard once made a droll comment about once you've experienced the Johnstown flood, you're suspicious of all rivers. Well, I have been in a river flood, but I have seen a coral snake up close. I've seen a barracuda up close. I've seen the effects of a stingray, and I have seen the effect of an alligator up close. I heard a comment several years back regarding being kicked by a horse. Generally, you don't need to be kicked by a horse twice to understand that being kicked by a horse is not a good thing. Well, I learned with all these experiences that I had, I wasn't going to push my luck in situations. To this day, I look before I leap. I think about what the consequences of actions are going to be. I am aware of my surroundings. And I believe, and another joke, nobody ever got hurt by being too cautious. Words I live by. I want to thank you for listening. A little editorial comment. This is my 30th episode. I didn't think I would make it this far. I thought I'd probably do about 5 or 6 episodes, and personally, I'm really surprised that I've done 30 episodes. But I think I'm going to take a little bit of a break, a short break, and then we will start up again. But I want to thank you as the listeners. I hope you've enjoyed the episodes. I'm just amazed at the feedback that I've gotten, and I'm thankful for each and every one of you listening. Thank you again.